All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show my good friend Marc Scribner, Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at the Recent Foundation. Welcome to Free the Economy, Mark.
Well, thank you for having me, Richard. Great to be
Uh,
here.
so you recently testified before the House Transportation Committee. Congratulations and my condolences. Congress, they're very important, but they're frequently ridiculous. But they have important issues to deal with. So uh, your comments talked about the transit productivity crisis. So we're talking about public transit like buses and subways and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of people who, maybe don't think about this a lot, don't think about buses and subways as being productive in the same way that like a factory is productive where you could kind of measure the output. But anything that we put money into and expect something out of, we can measure the productivity of that. So how how does this work that America is in a transit productivity crisis, and like how has that changed or gotten worse over time?
Yeah, so I mean, and there's a lot like you said, measuring output for the money or the resources we put into it. It's very important to gauge productivity, and there's a lot of ways you can do that in transit. So you can do that in terms of ridership, in terms of hours worked, in terms of various metrics. But regardless of the productivity measure you choose, one thing you can see is that transit productivity it's been declining for a long time. Much of that, the principal reason is that we continue providing roughly the same level of service, actually increasing level of service, while we're seeing ridership decline. More importantly, we're spending a lot more money to provide that same level of service or slightly more service than we were decades ago. And ridership, particularly when it came to COVID-19, where you saw a spike in remote work and working from home, you saw transit ridership just decimated and quite literally decimated. It declined by over 90% at its worst. And we're still in this phase. Remote work remains elevated, likely elevated permanently, well above its pre-pandemic share of commuting. Um, and ridership is just not recovering on transit. And this, I think, bodes poorly both for the transit systems, but also the central business districts that depended on shuttling office workers in 5 days a week. And then the businesses, the lunch cafes, all of those businesses that depend on that travel activity have been suffering, and it does not appear that a recovery, at least to pre-pandemic levels, is in sight.
Well, yeah, so the COVID part is the most sort of the more dramatic and recent part that people are likely to pay attention to. But the there's sort of like two parts here. There's the long decline of multiple decades, and then there's the uh, acute decline of the past 5 years, kind of COVID era. Whereas you sort of mentioned this. Other people have written about this as well that there there used to be more people packed into more, subway and rail car and trolley car lines, 50, 70 years ago than today. And the question is, well, what was that decline? And so there's one popular conspiracy theory, which is that ExxonMobil and GM sabotaged transit because they wanted everyone to force everyone into cars. That's the Roger Rabbit, Who Framed Roger Rabbit version of history, right? That the tire companies and the oil companies somehow intentionally tried to get rid of things like trolley cars in streets. But then there's the less crazy version, which is Americans just got wealthier and they decided they liked having their own cars, and so more people bought cars and people bought houses in the suburbs, and they liked driving those cars. As someone who is sort of eyeballs deep in all this like transit stuff and transportation debates, um, how how much do you think that catches on with like ordinary people? Do you think regular people are believing these sort of like conspiracy theory version of why we don't have streetcars in every city anymore? Or do people kind of understand that, like, well, just demographics changed, money changed, people liked driving?
Well, I'll be honest. I don't think most people really pay attention to this
To
discussion at
the extent
all.
that they do, though.
Yes, most people are driving their cars and just sort of that's that. We have the household car ownership is over 90% in the United States now, and that's how most people get around. The median American takes zero transit trips today. And that's been true for a long time. But transit's decline, you're absolutely right. Transit's decline began at around 1920. And it was precisely because the Model T, affordable automobiles or more affordable automobiles became available on the market, and incomes were rising, so people were purchasing those, and taking direct to door-to-door trips was preferable than taking transit. And I think it's important, a lot of people forget that transit in that period was primarily a middle class mode of transportation. The urban poor could not afford the nickel fare. They walked everywhere. And a lot of times they were living in a tenement building next door to their factory, so they didn't have to walk all that far. But that was how most people, most people in cities walked, because they could not even afford transit. When transit declined, it was interesting. Transit, the Model T came out, and some entrepreneurs, many entrepreneurs, figured out that you could bolt on some wooden benches in the back and carry around a bunch of people and charge them the same fare as a streetcar. So and the slang for a nickel back then was a jitney. And so they called these Model Ts rolling around with wooden benches on the back jitneys. The transit lobby back then, it was called the American Electric Railway Association, what is now the American Public Transportation Association. They lobbied hard against the introduction of jitneys. They did not like that competition, and they succeeded in imposing onerous regulations, licensing schemes, and the like on those to limit that kind of competition. But that did not really, prevent the decline of transit. That continued. And when we get to the Roger Rabbit history lesson, the Great Streetcar Conspiracy, as it's been called, and debunked. But you saw in the 1920s, you saw that transition begin, and it away from streetcars, and it largely had to do with the introduction of the diesel bus, which was much cheaper to operate and maintain. Um, Transit fares back then had been capped by local regulation, usually at a nickel. So they couldn't earn adequate returns. And those were private streetcar transit companies. So their capital stock started rapidly depreciating. So that's why you saw the transition to buses. Now, were the oil companies and Goodyear tires, were they supportive of that transition? Absolutely. That was a way for them to gain greater market share. Um, However, most of the transition can be attributed just to the internal economics of the transit industry itself, rather than some shadowy conspiracy to undermine trolleys. It was just, trolleys, you're stuck in a fixed track in the street, operated under franchise with the city, and the city still owns those streets, and you have little control over that. So why not just operate a rubber tire vehicle where you don't really have to care as much about the infrastructure? Um, and it's, like I said, much cheaper. So that is sort of how we transitioned to diesel buses in the United States, and we saw that transition continue um, into the 1960s, when the transit agency, the private industry, was in terminal decline, and that's when we saw the government takeover of most of the private transit companies in the United States.
Yeah, well, speaking of government being in charge more and more of transit, we have as you point out, the sort of like declining productivity, we're like not getting as much for the money we're spending. So we've had greater and greater amounts of taxpayer money on urban transit systems over time. You mentioned in your testimony that more of that is now federal, uh, and which means everyone's paying for it, not just the people in the city that are being served by any given transit system. And we seem to have gotten less of that, um, less bang for our buck. But it seems also sort of analogous to plenty of other instances in government policy where we say, well, this thing is really important, so we need to throw government money at it, and yet it seems to have well, not to have worked, to put it simply. But we but at the very least, we're not getting what we want for our money. So I think that's true in higher education. We argue that's true in healthcare. More and more government money has seemed to have like inflated costs and made things worse. Certainly, at the very least, not as much better as we would have expected. So if all this like extra money, and again back to specifically transportation, if all this didn't end up giving us dramatically better services, where did all the money go?
Well, primarily I mean, we build some really expensive projects in this country. So hats off, United States planners and engineering firms. We have the the most expensive transit infrastructure in the country. But when you look at operations, and that was the primary focus of my testimony, was on the operating side rather than the capital side of transit. It's mainly going to transit agency employees. About more than two-thirds of operating expenses, transit agency operating expenses, go to labor. And that is largely, if you look at federal transit law and you look at the state and local policies governing transit operations, the conclusion you can't escape is that this is primarily a jobs program. And that is those are the primary, absolutely people benefit. The very, few riders in the United States who use transit outside of New York City benefit from transportation. That's absolutely true. But the big beneficiaries and how the law is structured in the United States, it goes toward labor. And that is that's been since the beginning of federal transit policy in 1964. It has been let's lock in the status quo and protect labor at all costs. And quite, all costs is turned out to be quite expansive.
And when you say labor, you mean organized labor, right? So these are
Yes.
almost always labor union jobs. It's not just obviously there's always going to be significant cost to the people running the system because you need people to run it, right? But the fact that this is uh, uh, labor unions and labor union contracts plays into the dynamics of this and even the political dynamics of it, right? Because there are plenty of government programs to favor labor unions. The current Biden administration has been very aggressive about saying that they want to support labor unions explicitly when it comes to government contracting and things like that. Um, so that how does that angle work, right? How is it different from, we need this, we're always going to need to spend a lot of money on people because it's a people intensive process versus we have to specifically negotiate with long-term recognized labor unions.
Yeah, and it's the labor history in transit is actually pretty interesting because, like I said, transit began primarily as a private enterprise in the United States. Now, granted by government franchise, but these were private companies operating streetcars and buses in our cities. Um, so when the private transit industry was in terminal decline, we're entering the 1960s. Um, the big fear back then of government takeovers among the unions was that uh, government was a union buster. And that was true. The government was historically very hostile to public sector collective bargaining. So, a key provision of the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, which was the foundational and remains the foundational federal transit law in the United States, and that's what provided the cities and states funds to take over bankrupt private transit companies. There's a provision in there called Section 13C, still on the books, still arguably gotten worse over the years, but it is designed to protect previous collective bargaining agreements, and basically it makes it impossible for government transit agencies receiving federal funds to do anything that would somehow or be harm or even perceived as harming transit agency employees. And you can see this taken to pretty extreme levels. I mean, you mentioned the Biden administration's very pro-labor stance. One thing the Biden administration did that didn't get a lot of attention outside of California was it came in and tried to withhold $12 billion in basically all of California's transit funding because California legislators in 2013 had enacted very modest public employee pension reforms. So on that basis, they said this was harming transit workers. We will not certify you under Section 13C. Therefore, we are withholding this $12 billion that they were expecting. And in fact, if it was critical for continuing operations of transit in California. Now, the courts ultimately sided in favor of California. California challenged that. But it was interesting to see, for a supposedly extremely pro transit administration, to see them, basically threatening to shut down transit in America's largest state because of some, modest labor policy tweaks that were not even directly focused on transit employees a decade earlier. Just sort of goes to show how powerful the labor protections in federal law are, and that if you have someone in the executive branch controlling those levers of power, what they can use those authorities to do. And it's quite expansive authority. And I think that provision, Section 13C alone, is responsible for much of the at least more recent decades transit productivity decline, because it basically prevents any efficiency enhancing activities at transit agencies.
Wow, that's especially dramatic in California, which is not exactly a right to work state, right? California is pretty much considered a pretty pro labor union state, pretty blue state. Um, so I mean, it's interesting because if you have a provision that says, nothing can ever happen that transit union workers won't like, in effect, well, they probably won't like efficiency gains, even though almost anyone would say, oh, well, we would like efficiency gains because that means we're getting more stuff for less money. Um, so so that's a very important history of this. But I'm thinking about like the future now. So we talked about we had this big ridership drop off, a very steep temporary ridership drop off during COVID. But then we're still down significantly from pre-COVID, like transit ridership. And if you talk to a lot of advocates of mass transit funding, people who think there should be, more trains, more rail, more buses, there should be more federal funding for all this stuff. Um, they act like we're on an inevitable path towards more and more people taking transit all the time, right? They talk about a future where there's, 10 times as many people taking transit and everyone gets rid of their cars. Um, but, we're still like, I think I think you said three quarters down from, we're only at like 75% of where we were in 2019, right? So we're not exactly on a unstoppable rocket ship to everyone taking transit. Um, what is the next step here? Is it, but I guess in terms of not even what you would recommend, but what do you think is sort of like possible? You've got the very highly motivated pro transit people who want everyone to ditch their cars. But are we ever going to get to where those people want us to be? Does it even make sense that we are that the projections of a sort of, massive increase in transit ridership is going to happen unless we all get too poor to afford cars.
Well, I think that's really the only way you're going to see the transit renaissance. If you look at the urban planner or transportation scholarly journals, um, every decade there's kind of a flurry of papers with transit renaissance question mark. Now in the Obama administration, there were some people who were, omitted that question mark, claiming we were in a transit renaissance, even though for most of that period ridership was declining, and at best it was stable. The only thing that was a renaissance for, we saw increasing real wages and the number of employees at transit agencies. So it was a bit of a renaissance for transit labor. But in terms of ridership, in terms of impact on society, which I think is what we should ultimately care about, transportation is a means to an end. It has no intrinsic value. And how people get around is what we should be focused on. And I think that's sort of the kind of problem, is that we have a lot of utopians who've kind of partnered with the transit lobby. And the transit lobby, I mean, their number one goal is more subsidies. Now they're about a 90% subsidy business. So their goal is more subsidies, reforms. I've talked to many people in the industry. They privately agree with me. They say we could never say that because they need the unions. The unions, I mean, their chief goal is more subsidies, more workers, more dues. And, if you're not supporting subsidies in the transit world, you're not a transit ally. But some of the sort of the utopian urbanist kind of writing, I was going to say thinking, but some of that you've seen, and it's gotten quite popular in some quarters. But again, I've just returned to the data. There's no evidence supporting anything that they claim. There was never been a transit renaissance. There doesn't appear to be any trend toward a transit renaissance. People actually continue getting wealthier. One thing you notice is that low-income Americans who do take transit, they tend not to take it very long because they get better jobs, higher incomes, and then the first thing they do, they buy a car. And that is a trend we have seen, for generations now in the United States. And I don't see that reversing unless, as you said, there's some sort of catastrophic event that makes us much poorer so we can't afford cars. Although, if we do see transit ridership increase after something horrible like that, I don't know if people will be calling that a transit renaissance. But yeah, I mean, I think going forward, I think the realistic thing to do is to look at the data and then say, look, transit is going to be a niche mode in the United States. First, look that 45% of all US transit trips take place in the New York metropolitan area. So whatever you're doing, if you're not in New York City and you're a transit advocate, take all the data from New York out of your equation, out of your thinking, and then start looking at the rest. And I think you can still provide lifeline service, which I think that's the best case for transit, is to provide it to people who truly cannot afford private means of transportation. The good news is that isn't very many people. That's a very small share of the US population. So that you do this efficiency, it need not break the bank. And that's why I think you've got to start, being, and this will upset the sort of the transit blob, which is, uniformly focused on more and more subsidies, all those interest groups that are part of that. But if you truly care about transit, you've got to do something about transit labor, which is hoovering up all of the rents and really preventing you from providing better transit service. So if we do take on Section 13C, and then encourage transit agencies to negotiate better collective bargaining agreements over time. You can do things like contracting out service, hopefully without a union. You can save 30% just if by outsourcing transit bus service there. Going forward, I think there's a great opportunity with automation. We have for rail transit automation, so for subways, and increasingly light rail, there's mature technology on the market deployed globally. I mean, and I said I submitted responses to questions for the record for the committee, but there are dozens of cities around the world with autonomous subway systems, or urban rail systems, including places where you wouldn't necessarily expect, like Brazil and several poorer countries in Eastern Europe and Asia, Bangkok recently. So you need not be the wealthiest country in the world to implement these kind of cost saving and efficiency measures. And the data aren't great on what kind of savings you can enjoy from automating your urban rail transit lines. And granted, it is more if you're trying to automate an existing line, that is a more complex endeavor and expensive endeavor than automating a newly built line. But comparing some researchers at NYU last year looked at a few of these lines, and they concluded that you could save about 45% just from automating your trains, 45% of your operating costs. And to put that in perspective, go back. So the COVID, the ridership, declines. Let's go back a few years before that. But so looking at that data, if you were able to save 45% on your systems, New York, San Francisco, Boston, and several other cities would have had operating profits if they were able to automate their lines and enjoy those 45% savings. So you can, through competitive contracting and automation, I think going forward, we're seeing, with Waymo and other autonomous vehicle companies, you're going to see more road automation in the future too. And perhaps the future of transit is not a 40-foot bus. I know it's hard to imagine. But there are technologies coming online that have the potential to greatly reduce operating expenses, and then couple that with competitive contracting, break up these transit cartels. I think you could still provide lifeline service to people who cannot afford cars, or private transportation, pay their own way, without this just being such a fiscal black hole. And that's really what it is. I mean, I don't think Americans really appreciate how much we spend on transit, but so transit accounts for less than 2% of person trips and basically zero freight, but gets about a quarter of federal, state, and local transportation spending. That's a pretty wide gulf. And I think people are, as the spending increases, as the ridership does not, I think more and more politicians and the public are going to start asking these tough questions. Why are we spending so much and getting so little?
Yeah, that I like the comparison you had with some of these international rail systems that have embraced things like automation, or they've been built automated from the beginning, because this is one of those cases where, on any topic, there's always potential for comparison. Where what are we doing in the United States versus what are peer countries doing? What can we learn from them? And when it comes to things like transportation, I feel like it's always people on the left saying we should be more like Europe. We should be more like Europe, right? We should have more rail. We should have more, bike lanes, and we should always learn from those countries and be more like them. Um, but the international comparisons don't always run in the same direction, right? Sometimes the international comparisons are actually we should, slash labor costs and automate things and contract them out because that's what that's what other countries are doing to save money. So the like let's be more like Europe uh, talking point doesn't always lead you in the direction that some transportation advocates assume it will.
Right. And you're absolutely right. Competitive contracting, privatization is widely used in urban transportation in Europe. And yeah, I mean, I think that this is something transit advocates in the United States, I mean, there's a lot of things they don't appreciate, but one on competitive contracting is that everyone knows transit agencies can perform poorly, your provider can perform poorly. A major virtue of competitive contracting is that if your provider is performing poorly, you can fire that company. You can terminate that contract for cause. You can't do that in a just 100% public sector environment where you have not only the special labor protections for transit employees, but also the sort of the general civil service protections, which are also there. And that's the thing that when the Section 13 debate comes up, you get the unions say this would be the end of us. I mean, I don't think that's true because every other labor law that applies to the public sector would still apply. Section 13C is a unique provision that grants special above and beyond labor protections just to public transit workers. So eliminating Section 13C, that does not automatically force transit agencies to negotiate better collective bargaining agreements. It wouldn't necessarily further additional public sector labor reforms. But it would eliminate the special privileges, the unique privileges that only public transit agency employees have in the United States. And I think this was lost on when I testified, this was lost on many members, including some Republicans from New York who are apparently vying up for reelection and vying for the transit worker vote. But yeah, this doesn't get complete. Even if you were to completely eliminate Section 13C, repeal it all, it does not do anything to collective bargaining that other federal laws, other state laws, other local ordinances don't already provide. It's this unique special privilege that we're talking about here that uniquely disadvantages transit agencies relative to other government agencies to trying to do self-help and reform.
All right. Uh, that's a pretty good summary, Mark. So thanks for being with us. And before we go, where should people find all of your stuff online?
Well, it was great to be here with you, Richard, talking transit. I always love talking transportation. And if you want to read more about transportation from a free market perspective, you can go to reason.org. Me and my Reason colleagues, transportation team colleagues, regularly publish about all modes of transportation and what we can do to make them better.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for being with us, Mark.
Thank you, Richard.